Victoria Hawthorne didn't say a word. She picked up that crystal pitcher of ice water and hurled it full force directly into Ava's face. In front of 40 women, in her own home on purpose. The crash, the gasp, the silence, Ava's white dress was destroyed. Ice cubes scattered across the marble floor, and the man she was going to marry stood 10 feet away and did absolutely nothing. Victoria smiled. Now everyone can see exactly what you are. But what Victoria didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that outside those doors a convoy of black vehicles had just stopped. And the man stepping out of them was about to make Victoria Hawthorne regret every single second of this moment. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning everything changed began the way most devastating days do, quietly, without warning, wrapped inside something that looked almost ordinary. Ava Mitchell woke up at 6:30 in the Hawthorne's East.
Yes, suite. In a bed that cost more than 3 months of her first apartment's rent.
The sheets were Italian linen, the pillows were stuffed with Siberian goose down. The view outside the window showed 3 acres of manicured lawn, a stone fountain, and hedges trimmed into the shapes of animals that probably had their own dedicated gardener. And yet, despite all of that, she hadn't slept, not even close. She lay on her back, staring at the coffered ceiling for most of the night, replaying the dinner conversation in her head, the way you replay a car crash, not because you want to, but because your mind won't let you stop. "You seem like a nice girl," Victoria Hawthorne had said, cutting her filet mignon with the kind of precision that made it feel like a threat. Nice girls usually understand when they don't belong in certain families. Ava had smiled. She'd kept her voice even. She'd said something polite and forgettable, the way you do when you're a guest in someone's house and you're choosing your battles. But lying there in the dark at 6:30 in the morning, she thought maybe she'd been choosing wrong. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment, feet on the cold marble floor, breathing. She thought about Ethan. She thought about the way he'd looked at his mother across that dinner table, not with disagreement, not with defense, but with the particular kind of silence that means a person has made a choice and they're hoping you won't notice. She thought about calling Daniel. Her older brother answered on the second ring, the way he always did, because Daniel Mitchell had been answering Ava's calls on the second ring since she was 9 years old, and their parents were going through the kind of divorce that turns children into small, terrified adults overnight. "You sleep?" he asked. No hello, they hadn't done hellos in years. No, how bad? She looked out the window at the fountain. A bird was sitting on the edge of it, perfectly still. She said, "I don't belong here." A pause. "She's right that you don't belong there," Daniel said. "But not for the reasons she thinks, Daniel. I'm serious, Ab. You're the best person I know. That place doesn't deserve you." "I love Ethan." Another pause, longer this time. "I know you do." He didn't say anything. When she said those things at dinner, he just sat there. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted. She knew her brother well enough to know that 4 seconds of silence from Daniel Mitchell meant he was measuring exactly how much of what he was thinking he was going to say out loud. "Come home," he finally said. "Not yet, Ava, I need to know Daniel. I need to know who he actually is, what he's actually made of." "You understand that." He understood. Of course he did. They were built from the same material, the two of them shaped by the same hard years, the same lessons learned watching their parents choose status over love and end up with neither. Daniel had built his empire with the same ferocity that Ava had built her independence, and both of them had spent their adult lives asking the same quiet question of every person who came close: "Do you see me, or do you see what I can do for you?" "Call me if anything happens," Daniel said. "Nothing's going to happen." She was wrong about that. She was completely catastrophically wrong about that. The gathering was described on Victoria Hawthorne's personal calendar, and Ava had seen it, briefly, on the leather-bound schedule book Victoria kept on her writing desk as an intimate afternoon reception. 40 women. 40 women in designer clothing with diamond earrings and carefully arranged hair, and the particular kind of perfectly maintained expressions that wealthy people develop when they've spent decades performing happiness for one another. Ava dressed carefully that morning. She chose the white dress, the one Ethan had picked out for her, in a boutique in the Back Bay. The smell scent made her look like the most beautiful person in any room. She'd packed it specifically for this trip, folded it between layers of tissue paper, carried it like an offering. She should have left it in the suitcase. She knew that now. But she hadn't known it then. She walked into the reception room at 2 in the afternoon and felt the temperature drop immediately, not the actual temperature, but the social temperature. That invisible chill that moves through a room when someone walks in who wasn't expected to fit and doesn't quite. 40 pairs of eyes, 40 brief assessments, 40 women who had known Victoria Hawthorne for decades, who had attended her parties and her galas and her charity luncheons, who understood the rules of this particular world the way Ava understood the rules of spatial proportionate and structural integrity. Victoria moved through them like a shark through water, graceful, certain, aware of exactly where every creature in the ocean stood in relation to herself. Ava, she said, finding her near the drinks table. You look comfortable. It wasn't a compliment. Ava understood that. Thank you, Victoria. That dress is very... Victoria paused, tilting her head slightly, the way a woman does when she's constructing an insult that sounds like an observation. Optimistic, smiled. Ethan chose it. Yes, Victoria said. Well, Ethan has always been generous with his encouragement. She moved away. Ava exhaled slowly and reached for a glass of sparkling water. The first hour passed the way those hours always pass, in small talk that wasn't small at all, in questions designed to measure and categorize, in conversations that were really interviews in disguise. A woman named Patricia, silver hair, Chanel suit, the kind of handshake that communicates net worth, cornered Ava near the fireplace. So you're the fiancé. Ethan's told us very little about you. We're private people, Ava said. Interior design, is that right? Residential? Mostly commercial, actually. I just finished a hotel renovation in Cambridge. Patricia's eyebrows moved upward slightly, not impressed exactly, but recalibrating. Cambridge. Which hotel? The Meridian. A pause. The Meridian had won 3 architectural awards the previous year. Patricia knew this. Ava watched her know it. That was you? My firm, yes. Patricia studied her for a moment. Victoria didn't mention that. Victoria doesn't know, Ava said simply. And that was the first mistake she made that afternoon. Not because it was wrong, but because Patricia walked directly to Victoria's side 30 seconds later, leaned in close, and said something that made Victoria's eyes find Ava across the room with a new, sharper quality. Not respect, not admiration, competition. Ethan wasn't there for the first part of the afternoon. He'd been pulled into a phone call with his father's attorneys, something about a business arrangement, something about quarterly projections, and he'd squeezed Ava's hand before leaving and said, I'll be back in an hour. You'll be fine, my mother likes you. She'd looked at him. She does, he insisted. She just has a particular way of showing it. Ethan, 1 hour, he said. I promise. He was gone for 3. And in those 3 hours, Ava learned things she hadn't wanted to know. She learned them in pieces, the way you learn the worst truth slowly, from the edges, from fragments of conversations that were almost but not quite hidden from her. She was standing near the terrace doors when she heard Victoria's voice carry from the adjoining room, low and controlled, speaking to a woman whose face Ava couldn't see. Obvious she has no idea what she's walking into. She seems intelligent enough, the other woman said. Intelligence isn't breeding, Margaret. The girl grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Worcester. She went to a state school. She's charming, I'll grant you that. But charm doesn't fix what Ethan needs fixed. And what does Ethan need fixed? A pause, the sound of ice shifting in a glass. We're in a complicated position. Temporarily, the market has been unkind. If Ethan were to marry someone with genuine resources, or at least with connections to genuine resources, and does she have those? Her brother works in technology. Some startup or other, which means nothing. Which means Ethan made a very poor decision based on a very pretty face, and now I have to manage the consequences. Ava stood very still. Her heart was beating with a strange, measured calm, the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from the sudden, crystalline clarity of understanding something you'd been half knowing for weeks without letting yourself know it. The Hawthorne family was broke, not ordinary broke. Not temporarily short broke. Broke in the way that only people who have been very, very wealthy can be broke catastrophically, secretly, desperately, with a mansion full of mortgaged furniture and a reputation built entirely on the architecture of debt. And Victoria wanted Ethan to marry money. She'd looked at Ava Mitchell, with her state school degree and her two-bedroom apartment background, and her brother who works in technology, and she'd seen exactly what she'd intended to see. Nothing worth anything, nothing that could save them. Ava walked away from the terrace doors before they finished speaking. She walked back into the main reception room, picked up her glass of sparkling water, and stood very straight and very still and made a decision. She would wait. She would see what kind of man Ethan Hawthorne was when it mattered. And she would have her answer. Victoria gathered her guests around after 4 o'clock, a gathering that looked casual but wasn't. The way nothing Victoria Hawthorne did was ever actually casual. She had a gift for staging moments, for creating scenes that felt spontaneous but were constructed with the precision of a courtroom argument. "I think," Victoria said, with the warm smile she wore for audiences, "that we should all take a moment to formally welcome Ethan's fiancée. After all, she may soon be part of this family." The may was deliberate. Ava heard it. She smiled and stood and accepted the mild, polite applause of 40 women who were assessing her in real time, and she thought, "I have survived worse than this." "Ava, dear," Victoria said, turning toward her with that smile still perfectly in place, "we were all just discussing our backgrounds. Our families, where we come from. Won't you share a little about yours?" The room was very quiet, 40 women watching, all those careful eyes. "Of course," Ava said. "I grew up in Worcester. My parents divorced when I was young. I put myself through school, started my own firm 7 years ago, and I've been building it ever since." "How admirable," Victoria said in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. "And your family, do you have siblings?" "I have an older brother." "And what does he do?" The room seemed to lean in slightly. Or maybe that was just Ava's perception, the way a moment can expand around you when you know something that everyone else in the room doesn't. "He works in technology," she said. Victoria smiled. The exact smile Ava had heard in her voice through the terrace door. Technology. She let the words sit for a moment. She turned slightly toward her guests, sharing the moment. "How wonderfully general. Does he perhaps repair computers? My gardener's son does that." "Very good with laptops." The laughter that moved through the room was the specific kind of laughter that requires permission. Victoria had given permission. The guests accepted it gratefully. Ava looked toward the door. Where was Ethan? He should have been back an hour ago. He should have been standing beside her right now. He had promised. "I think what's so interesting," Victoria continued, moving slightly closer, "is that you seem to believe you belong here. That's a very, a very confident assumption for someone with your background." "My background," Ava said quietly, "has taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by their address or their parents' income." "No," Victoria agreed pleasantly, "but it does tend to predict a certain compatibility. Don't you think? Birds of a feather, as they say." "I think people are more complicated than birds. And I think," Victoria said, her voice dropping slightly, losing its performing quality and finding something colder underneath, "that you have been very clever. And very patient, and that you've done an excellent job of convincing my son that you are something you are not." The room was absolutely still. "I am exactly what I appear to be," Ava said. "You appear to be a woman who doesn't belong in this house." "Victoria," the voice came from the doorway, but it wasn't Ethan. It was an older woman, one of the guests, looking uncomfortable. "Perhaps I'm speaking," Victoria said, without looking away from Ava. And then, with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has decided that a moment has arrived, she reached toward the drinks table beside her. She picked up the crystal pitcher. It was full, ice water, still cold, still condensing against the crystal. Ava saw her reach for it. She had 1 second to understand what was about to happen. 1 second, and she didn't move. Later she would ask herself why she didn't move, why she stood there perfectly still, and let it happen. And the only answer she could find was this: she needed to know. She needed everyone in that room to know. She needed the moment to be undeniable, witnessed, real. Victoria Hawthorne threw the pitcher of ice water directly at Ava Mitchell. The sound was extraordinary, the crack of ice against crystal, the rush of water, the collective gasp of 40 women who had, in their wildest imaginings of this afternoon, not imagined this. The water hit Ava's dress like a wall, cold, immediate. Shocking in the way that only cold water can be shocking, hitting every nerve at once, stealing the breath. She stood there, she did not fall, she did not scream. She did not even step backward. She stood in the center of the room, soaked from shoulder to hem, and she looked at Victoria Hawthorne, and she said nothing at all. The silence lasted 5 seconds. 10. Victoria's expression was something between triumph and the very first tremor of something she didn't quite recognize yet. She looked at the empty pitcher in her hand. She looked at Ava. She looked at her guests, 40 women, whose faces had transitioned from polite attention to genuine shock. Now Victoria said, but her voice was slightly less steady than it had been. Now everyone can see what you really are. What I really am, Ava said, very quietly, is a woman who gave you every opportunity to treat her with basic human decency. You don't, and I'm also the woman who is standing in front of 40 witnesses. Somewhere across the room, someone had already reached for their phone. And that was when the sound started. Ava heard it before she saw it, the specific sound of several large vehicles on a gravel drive, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to a single car but to a convoy. The kind of sound that makes people turn toward windows. Several of the guests moved toward the windows on instinct. What on earth, someone murmured. Victoria turned toward the sound. Her expression shifted from cold triumph into something confused, then concerned. Then the doors opened, not gently, not with a knock. The massive front doors of Hawthorne Manor came open, the way doors open when the person entering them does not require permission, has never required permission, and is walking into a room as a statement of fact rather than a request. 4 men entered first, large men in dark suits moving with the specific coordinated calm of people who are paid to manage situations before situations become problems. And then behind them, walking with the particular, unhurried certainty of a man who has never once in his adult life needed to rush to make an impression. Daniel Mitchell, he was 42 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall. He was wearing a simple black suit that probably cost more than the crystal pitcher Victoria had just used as a weapon, but you wouldn't know it to look at it, because Daniel Mitchell had long ago decided that wealth was not a costume. His eyes moved across the room in 3 seconds flat. He found his sister, he saw the white dress, he saw the water. He saw her standing there alone, in the center of the room, soaked and still and refusing to collapse. He walked across the marble floor with 7 steps and stopped in front of her. He said nothing for a moment. He simply looked at her older brother looking at younger sister, the way only someone who has known you your entire life can look at you, the way that sees past surfaces and straight into the truth of a moment. Then he took off his jacket. He draped it across her shoulders. Ava felt it land warm, heavy, carrying that particular scent of cedar and something clean that she associated specifically with her brother and with safety. And for the first time since the water hit her, her eyes filled. She blinked. She didn't let the tears fall. "I've got you," Daniel said quietly. "Just for her, just between them, I know," she whispered. Then he turned around, and he looked at Victoria Hawthorne. Victoria, who had thrown that pitcher with such confidence. Victoria, who had performed that moment for an audience of 40 women. Victoria, who had spent years building a social fortress out of names and family histories and carefully calibrated contempt for everyone who didn't qualify. Victoria, who was now looking at Daniel Mitchell, the way you look at something that has restructured every assumption you've just made. Because she recognized him. Of course she recognized him. His face had been on the cover of Forbes.
It had been in the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times, in every financial publication that mattered to people in Victoria Hawthorne's world.
His company, Titan Core Technologies, had recently completed a $72 billion expansion that had restructured the entire artificial intelligence industry. He was not someone who repaired computers. He was not a startup. He was Daniel Mitchell, and standing there in her reception room, beside his soaked younger sister, he was the single powerful person in this house by a margin that wasn't even close. Victoria's color, her carefully maintained, professionally preserved complexion, went gray. Not pink, not white. Gray the way people go gray when the floor has just disappeared beneath them. She started. The word came out wrong, thin. She tried again. Mr. Mitchell, you threw water on my sister, Daniel said. His voice was perfectly calm. It was the kind of calm that is not peace. It is the kind of calm that is absolute, complete certainty, the calm of a man who knows exactly what has happened, exactly what it means, and exactly what is going to happen next. It was a misunderstanding, Victoria said quickly. If you had known, Daniel said, that Ava was my sister. That's what you were going to say. Victoria's mouth opened and closed. So let me understand this correctly, Daniel said. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. The room was so absolutely silent that his normal speaking voice filled every corner of it. If she had been wealthy, if you had known her connections, you wouldn't have treated her this way. I never meant. You meant exactly what you did in front of 40 people. The pitcher of water, he paused. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice. Someone in the room made a small sound, not words, just a small, involuntary noise of recognition and discomfort. Victoria's hands were trembling slightly. Ava could see them from where she stood. Ava never told you who her brother was, Daniel continued, because she wanted to know whether the people in her life were decent human beings. That was the only test she was running. He looked around the room once, a brief, comprehensive survey. She was trying to find out if your son was worth marrying. Not by his bank account, by his character. The door at the far end of the room opened at that moment, and Ethan Hawthorne walked in. He stopped. He took in the room, his mother's stricken expression, the 40 silent guests, Daniel Mitchell standing in the center with his jacket on Ava's shoulders, and Ava herself, soaked, standing straight, her eyes finding his the moment he entered. Ethan's voice broke on the word. What happened? Nobody answered him immediately. He looked at his mother. He looked at the empty pitcher on the drinks table. He looked at Ava's dress. Something moved across his face, something complicated, something that contained several emotions arriving in rapid sequence. Mom, he said. His voice was different now, quieter. It was an accident, Victoria said quickly. It wasn't, Ava said. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, and they all felt the ripples move as... Ethan looked at Ava, really looked at her, the way he hadn't in 3 hours, maybe longer than she'd allowed herself to admit. He looked at the dress he'd chosen, at the water soaking through it, at the expression on her face, which wasn't anger, which wasn't tears, which was something far more devastating than either of those things. It was clarity. She had her answer now. She had it completely. And Ethan could see that she had it. Ava, he said. He took a step toward her. Ava, I'm so sorry. I didn't know she was going... I know, Ava said. You didn't know. You were in the other room. She looked at him steadily. But you left me here. You said 1 hour. You said she liked me. She does. She just... Ethan, his name in her mouth, spoken that way, stopped him completely. Your mother told her guests this afternoon that you need to marry someone with resources. That the family is in a complicated position. The room went very still in a new way. Victoria made a sharp sound. That is private. I heard you through the terrace door, Ava said, still looking at Ethan. I wasn't hiding. I was standing near the window and you were in the next room, and I heard what you said to Margaret about your quarterly projections and your market position and what Ethan needs to fix. Ethan's face had gone the color of old paper. Is it true? Ava asked him. Quietly, just for him, in a room full of people. Are you in trouble? A long moment. It's complicated, he said. Is that a yes? Another moment. Yes, Ava nodded slowly. Okay, she breathed in once. And did you know, when you asked me to come here this weekend? Did you know what your mother was planning? What she was hoping I could provide? This was the question. This was the one that had been building in her chest since 6:30 in the morning, since the night before. Since the dinner table and the silence and the particular quality of Ethan's expression when his mother had said the things she'd said, and he'd said nothing at all. The pause that followed this question lasted long enough that it became its own kind of answer. "Ethan," she said, "I love you," he said, and there was real feeling in it. She believed it was real. She believed it, and it broke her heart in a specific, quiet way because love had never been the question. "I know you do," she said, "but that's not what I asked." He was quiet. Daniel watched. The 40 guests watched. Victoria Hawthorne stood near the drinks table, with her gray face and her trembling hands, and said nothing. "I thought," Ethan said finally, his voice low, "that if she got to know you, she would see what I see. I thought this weekend would change her mind, help her understand. But you didn't tell her who I was. You asked me not to. You said I wanted the people in your life to decide about me on their own." "Yes, that's what I wanted." Ava took the jacket from her shoulders gently, folding it, handing it back to her brother with both hands. "And they did, and now I know." "Ava, please, I'm not angry, Ethan." She said it, and she meant it. "I'm really not. I think you're a good person who made choices inside pressure that I don't fully understand. But I needed to know what kind of man you were in this moment. Right here, and I know now, then let me fix it," he said. There's nothing to fix." Her voice was gentle. Final. The voice of someone who has already walked through the hardest part of a decision and is standing on the other side of it. This was the answer I needed. She turned to Daniel. He was watching her with the expression he'd worn since childhood when she'd done something that impressed him, a very specific, very quiet look that she would have recognized in any room, in any light. "Ready," she said. "Been ready," he answered. She took one breath. She looked at the room one last time, all those faces, all those careful eyes, 40 women who had watched something happen today that none of them had planned for. Then she looked at Victoria Hawthorne, Victoria who had thrown the water, who had laughed with her guests, who had looked at an extraordinary woman and seen only what she wanted to see. "Thank you," Ava said to her. Victoria blinked. "What?" "For being exactly who you are," Ava said, without any pretending. It made everything much clearer, and she walked out of the room. Past the crystal pitcher, past the empty pitcher stand. Past 40 silent women and one stunned fiancé and one gray-faced mother who had just discovered the specific, irreversible consequence of mistaking kindness for weakness. Through the massive front doors of Hawthorne Manor. Into the clean afternoon air, with her brother beside her and his jacket back on her shoulders, and the certain, settled knowledge that she had just lost something she'd thought was everything and found, in losing it, something far more important. She had found the answer, and the answer had set her free. The convoy of vehicles waited on the gravel drive. A door was opened. Ava got in. Daniel got in beside her. The car moved. She watched Hawthorne Manor grow smaller through the window, the fountain, the hedges, the stone steps where she'd arrived 3 days ago, with a folded white dress and the particular hope that comes from believing someone is better than they've shown you. She didn't cry until the gate closed behind them, and even then she didn't cry for long. Because Ava Mitchell had been through harder things than this. And she had always come through them. What nobody in that room knew yet, what Victoria Hawthorne and her 40 guests and her devastated son could not possibly have understood, in that moment was that this afternoon was not an ending. It was a beginning, and the beginning was going to change everything. Not for the Hawthornes, for Ava, because the woman who had been thrown water at in her own fiancé's family home was not ordinary. She had never been ordinary, she had simply been patient. And patience, as it turns out, is the most underestimated power in the world. The car ride back to Boston took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Ava knew because she watched the clock on the dashboard the entire time. Not because she was counting, but because her mind needed something concrete to hold on to, something measurable, something that moved forward in only one direction, while everything else she'd believed about her future was quietly dismantling itself in the back of her chest. Daniel didn't try to fill the silence. That was one of the things she'd always loved most about her brother. He understood that some silences weren't empty, some silences were doing necessary work. And he'd learned over 42 years of being Daniel Mitchell to let necessary work happen without interrupting it. He sat beside her in the back of the car and looked at his phone and said nothing. She appreciated it more than she could have said. It was Ava who finally spoke, somewhere on the highway outside Worcester, passing the exit that would have taken them to the street where they'd grown up. "You knew," she said. He didn't look up from his phone. "Knew what, specifically, about the Hawthorns, their financial situation?" A pause. He set his phone face down on his knee. "My team flagged it 8 weeks ago." She turned to look at him. 8 weeks, yes, and you didn't tell me." He met her eyes. "You asked me not to investigate him. You asked me specifically in those exact words not to run a background on Ethan or his family. You said you wanted to figure it out yourself." She remembered saying that. She remembered standing in Daniel's kitchen in his house in Cambridge, holding a mug of coffee, telling him that she needed this one thing, this one relationship to be entirely her own. No research teams, no financial analysts, no protective older brother running quiet investigations. She remembered how certain she'd been. "I didn't tell you," Daniel said carefully, "because you asked me not to. But I also didn't tell you because I wanted you to see it for yourself. I thought," he stopped, started again. "I thought if I showed you the numbers, you'd think I was trying to protect you by pushing you away from something that made you happy. And that's not, I didn't want to be that person. You could have said something, and what would you have done if I had?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "Exactly," he said quietly. She looked out the window. The exit sign for Worcester passed and disappeared. "How bad is it? The Hawthorne situation. Bad enough that they've been trying to sell the east wing of the property for 14 months without finding a buyer. Bad enough that 3 of their major investment vehicles are in default. Bad enough that Victoria Hawthorne has been attending events she can afford to attend for the past 2 years specifically to identify potential connections for Ethan." Ava absorbed this. She was auditioning women. She was auditioning families, Daniel corrected. Women with the right families. Women with the right bank accounts. Women who could be useful, and Ethan found me instead. "Ethan found you instead." Daniel picked up his phone again, then put it back down. "My honest read, he loves you, Ava. I think that part is real. I think he met you and he fell genuinely, completely in love with, and he told himself he could manage both the love and the family pressure. He told himself his mother would come around. He told himself it would work. He told himself a lot of things people do when they want something badly enough." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the landscape moved past gray sky, bare trees, the particular flat emptiness of Massachusetts in early March. "She threw water on me, Daniel. I know, in front of 40 people. I know," and he stood there. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the ones before it. It had weight. It had the specific gravity of something true and painful that neither of them wanted to carry, but both of them understood they had to. "Yeah," Daniel said. "Just that, just the one word." Ava closed her eyes. She thought about Ethan's face when he'd walked into the room. The way he'd looked at the picture, at the dress, at her, the sequence of it, the shock of it, and underneath the shock, something else. Something she'd been trying not to name, relief. Not relief that she was all right. Relief that Daniel had arrived. Relief that the situation had a solution that didn't require him to have done anything differently. She'd seen it. In 3 seconds she'd seen it, and she couldn't unsee it. "I want to know everything," she said, "about the Hawthorns. The full picture, all of it." Daniel nodded once. "I'll have it ready in the morning." The car kept moving. The clock on the dashboard kept moving forward. And Ava Mitchell sat in the back seat of her brother's car, in his jacket that smelled like cedar and safety, and she made the quiet, private decision to stop being someone who waited to be told the truth. From now on, she was going to find it herself. The next morning arrived with the particular clarity that only comes after a night of no sleep, everything slightly too sharp, slightly too bright, the world with all its softness stripped away. Ava was at Daniel's kitchen table at 5:45 with a cup of black coffee and her laptop, and the specific energy of someone who has moved past grief and arrived, without quite planning to, at something harder and more useful. She'd been at it for an hour already when Daniel came downstairs. He saw her. He saw the laptop. He saw the 3 pages of handwritten notes beside the coffee cup. He went directly to the coffee maker without saying a word and poured himself a cup and came and sat across from her. "Sleep?" he asked. No, me neither. He reached across the table and turned one of the handwritten pages toward him. Read it for a moment, set it back. You found the mortgage records. Public filing from 11 months ago. East Wing listed as collateral on a credit facility with a private lending company I've never heard of. Which usually means, it means they couldn't get a conventional lender to take the risk, Daniel said. Because conventional lenders looked at the full picture and passed. What's the full picture? He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. The Hawthorne family has been living approximately $2.3 million per year above what their actual income supports. For the past 6 years, Ava set down her pen. The original family investments, the ones that built the Hawthorne name, they've been liquidating them quietly, one by one, since Ethan's father got sick. Robert Hawthorne made 3 catastrophically bad decisions in the 18 months before his diagnosis. By the time he understood what was happening, there wasn't enough left to reverse the slide. Victoria has been managing the decline ever since. Managing it, Ava repeated, meaning she's been hiding it. Meaning she's been putting everything she has into maintaining appearances. The parties, the events, the house, the social position. Because in her world in the world, she built her entire identity around the moment people know you're losing. You've already lost. Ava thought about the 40 women in that reception room. About the designer clothing and the diamond earrings and the carefully maintained expressions. About the way Victoria had moved through those women, like she owned the room because she did own the room, or she had once, and she was fighting with everything she had to go on owning it through the sheer force of performance. She's terrified, Ava said, not with sympathy, with comprehension. Yes, and she's been planning Ethan's marriage as a rescue operation. For at least 2 years, maybe longer, Daniel paused. My team identified 4 women before you, 4 women she'd attempted to position Ethan toward. All of them from families with significant liquid assets. All of them appropriate in Victoria's estimation for various reasons. None of them worked out, and then he found me, and then he found you. And he didn't tell her who you were, because I think some part of him wanted to believe that it wouldn't matter. That she would see what he saw. He was wrong, Daniel agreed. They sat with that for a moment, then Ava's phone vibrated on the table between them. She looked at the screen, Ethan. The name sat there, pulsing with the quiet insistence of an unanswered question. Daniel looked at it, looked at her, said nothing. She picked up the phone. She held it. She set it face down on the table without answering. He's called 9 times since last night, she said. I know, his number came up on my security team's report. He also called the main line for my office at 7:15 this morning. Daniel's voice was neutral, completely even. My assistant told him I wasn't available. He's panicking. Of course he's panicking. He watched the 2 of you walk out of that house yesterday, and he's smart enough to understand what that means. Daniel took a long sip of coffee. What he probably doesn't understand yet is the part that comes next. Ava looked up. What part comes next? The part where this becomes a business decision. She felt something shift in the room, something in her brother's voice, not harder exactly, but more precise. The voice he used in boardrooms, the voice she'd heard him use exactly twice before, both times in situations that had ended with someone leaving the table with significantly less than they'd arrived with. Tell me, she said. Daniel set down his mug. Titan Core has been looking at an infrastructure project. Large scale, it would require significant property in the greater Boston area. Commercial zoning, specific square footage, access to certain transit corridors. Ava watched him. The Hawthorne estate, he said simply, happens to sit on 17 acres that meet every single one of those requirements. The silence that followed this was extraordinary. Daniel. I'm not doing anything to them, Ava. I want to be clear about that. I'm not retaliating. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm simply telling you about a business situation that exists independently of anything that happened yesterday. He met her eyes. What I do about that situation is entirely separate from what happened to you. You understand that. I understand the distinction you're trying to make, she said carefully. Good, but you identified this property before yesterday. A pause, a very small one. My team has been evaluating several properties. Daniel, he looked at her steadily. I protect you, Ava. I've been protecting you since you were 9 years old and I was 16 and Dad left and we had $30 and a half empty refrigerator. And I told you it was going to be fine. I protected you then and I protect you now. The tools change. The intention doesn't. She felt the familiar ache of that, of being loved by someone so ferociously, so completely, that the protection sometimes felt indistinguishable from control. She'd spent her adult life walking the line between accepting it and asserting herself against it. Don't make a business decision based on what happened to me, she said. I make business decisions based on what makes sense for my company. Daniel, Ava, his voice was gentle, final, trust me. Her phone vibrated again, not Ethan this time. She looked at the screen. Victoria Hawthorne, both of them stared at the name. Daniel raised an eyebrow. How did she get this number? Ava asked. Ethan, Daniel said, obviously. Ava stared at the name for 3 full rings. Then she answered, Mrs. Hawthorne. The voice that came through the phone was not the voice from yesterday. Yesterday's voice had been cold and controlled and performing for an audience. This voice was something different, smaller, stripped of its architecture. Ava, a pause. I wanted to call. I can hear that. What happened yesterday? Another pause. Longer. I owe you an apology. A genuine one. What I did was it was unacceptable. Ava said nothing. She waited. I've been under considerable pressure, Victoria continued. That's not an excuse. I know that's not an excuse. But I want you to understand that I don't normally. Mrs. Hawthorne, Ava said, I've heard you speak to me honestly exactly once. It was through a terrace door when you didn't know I was listening. I'd like to offer you the opportunity to do it again, deliberately this time. A long silence. How much did you hear? Victoria asked. Enough. Another silence. Then something happened in the quality of the breathing. On the other end of the line, something shifted. Some remaining structure gave way, and Victoria Hawthorne said, in a voice that sounded for the first time like a human being rather than a performance, we're in serious trouble, Ava. The family. We've been in serious trouble for years, and I've been holding it together by my fingernails, and yesterday, she stopped. I looked at you, and I saw everything I was afraid of. A woman who didn't need us, and it terrified me. Ava closed her eyes. She had not expected honesty. She'd expected manipulation dressed as honesty, which is a different thing entirely and much easier to deal with. Genuine honesty from Victoria Hawthorne was something she hadn't prepared for. Why are you calling me? Ava asked. Because Ethan loves you. Because whatever I did yesterday, I cannot undo it, but I'm asking you not to. Victoria's voice broke slightly. Just slightly. Please don't punish him for what I did. Mrs. Hawthorne, Ava said quietly, Ethan is not being punished. Ethan made his own choices yesterday in that room. And I saw them clearly. He was trying to protect both of us. He was trying to avoid conflict, Ava said. Those are very different things. Silence, I know, Victoria said, and the weight of those 2 words, the exhaustion in them, the specific heaviness of a woman who knows something true and has known it for longer than she wanted to, landed with surprising force. I'm going to hang up now, Ava said. Ava, I wish your family well. I genuinely do. Whatever happens with your financial situation, I hope you find a way through it. She paused. But I think you know that Ethan and I are done, not because of yesterday specifically. Because yesterday showed me something I needed to see. She ended the call. Daniel was watching her across the table. Well, he said, she's more complicated than I thought, Ava said. Complicated people do terrible things, Daniel replied. The complication doesn't cancel the terrible. No, Ava agreed. It doesn't. She picked up her pen. She looked at her notes. Then she looked up at her brother with an expression he had recognized since she was 19 years old, and she'd decided to start her own firm instead of taking the job offer from the established Boston architecture company that had recruited her right out of school. The expression that meant she was already 3 steps ahead. I need to do something, she said, something real. Not about the Hawthorns, not about Ethan, for me. Tell me, the project I've been thinking about, the community center. She'd mentioned it before, in passing, over dinners and phone calls, the idea she'd been carrying around for 2 years without quite giving herself permission to commit to it. a center designed specifically for women rebuilding their lives after financial devastation or emotional abuse. Practical resources designed that communicated dignity instead of charity. Space that told people they were worth investing in. The one in Dorchester, Daniel said, "I've been waiting for the right time." There's no right time for things like that, there's just the decision. I know. She looked at her notes, at her handwriting, at the pages of research she'd compiled in the dark, early hours of this particular morning. I want to start it now. I want to start it because of yesterday and in spite of yesterday and completely independent of anything that happened at that house. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "You want to build something," he said. "I always want to build something." "Okay," he stood up. Refilled his coffee, came back to the table. "Tell me what you need." "I don't need your money. I know you don't. I asked what you need." She almost smiled. A meeting with the Dorchester Community Development Office. And an introduction to the Kellerman Foundation. They've been looking for a design partner for their Women's Transition Initiative for 8 months, and nobody's been able to find the right fit. "I can make both of those calls by noon. I know you can." And for what it's worth, Daniel said, "This is the version of you that has always been worth 10 of everyone in that room yesterday." She did smile then, small, real, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and steady. "Don't get sentimental," she said. "It's early," he laughed. Short and genuine. "God, you're like our mother when you do that." "Is that a compliment?" "It's the highest compliment I know." She looked back at her laptop, at the screen full of property records and financial filings, and the beginning of something she'd been building in the back of her mind for or two. She thought about Victoria Hawthorne's voice on the phone. The crack in it, the weight of 2 small words, "I know." She thought about Ethan's face when he'd walked into that room. The shock and the grief, and underneath it, the relief. She thought about the 40 women watching, about the water hitting the white dress. About standing there soaked and refusing to fall. She thought about what it felt like to know the truth about someone. Not the truth you hoped for, not the truth you'd constructed from the best moments and the kindest expressions. The truth that arrives without warning, without preparation, in the form of a man who stays silent when the person he loves needs him to speak. She thought about all of it, and then she set it down. Not forever. She was not the kind of person who could simply erase pain with willpower. She knew herself better than that, but for now, for today. She set it down and she picked up her pen and she wrote at the top of a clean page, Project Cornerstone. Phase 1, and she began. While Ava Mitchell sat in her brother's kitchen and began building something miles away in Hawthorne Manor, the world was moving in ways that none of them had fully anticipated yet. Victoria Hawthorne sat in her study with the phone in her lap and stared at the wall for a long time after the call ended. Around her, the house was very quiet, the kind of quiet that a large, expensive house produces when the performance has stopped and there's no one left to perform for. Ethan knocked on the door of the study at 9:15. He came in without waiting for her to answer something he'd started. Doing only in the past year, she'd noticed, as though the ritual of asking permission had gradually seemed less and less relevant as other certainties collapsed. He sat in the chair across from her desk. He looked terrible. She'd seen him look bad before after his father's diagnosis,
After the first round of investment.
after the conversation, where she'd finally told him the full extent of what they were dealing with. But this was different. This was a specific kind of terrible that had nothing to do with money. "She didn't answer when you called," Victoria asked. "She answered this morning, said she needed time." He looked at his hands. She sounded finished, not angry, just done. Victoria said nothing. "You spoke to her," Ethan said. "It wasn't a question." "Just now, I heard your voice, yes. What did she say?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Ava had said. About the terrace door, about honesty, about the difference between protecting someone and avoiding conflict. She thought about throwing that picture. She'd done it in a moment of something she wanted to call fury, but suspected was actually fear, which was worse. She'd stood in that room with 40 of her oldest friends, and she'd looked at this young woman in her son's chosen dress, and she'd felt the walls of everything she'd built closing in. And she'd done the thing that frightened people do when they feel cornered. She'd struck out. She said Ethan made his own choices, Victoria said. Ethan flinched. Small reel. She's right. I know she's right. Mom, he looked up at her. I stood there. I stood there and I didn't. He stopped. I've been sitting up all night trying to figure out why I didn't move. Why I didn't say something. And the only honest answer I can come up with is that I was afraid of you. Victoria felt this land somewhere specific and painful in her chest. Ethan, not physically. I don't mean that. I mean, I was afraid of disappointing you, of making the situation worse. He ran a hand through his hair. I've been afraid of your reaction to things for so long that it's become automatic. I just go quiet, and I know that's not an excuse. I know it doesn't make what I didn't do any better. Victoria looked at her son. This man, this 34-year-old man who had inherited his father's jaw and his grandfather's hands, and her own particular talent for caring too much about what other people thought. I've been afraid too, she said. The words came out differently than she'd expected. Smaller, for years.
I've been so afraid of all of this ending, of losing everything your grandfather built.
She stopped. Started again. I think I've been so afraid for so long that I forgot there are things worse than losing money. Ethan looked at her. Losing people. She stopped again. She was not accustomed to this, to saying the actual things. She would have been good for you. She would have been genuinely. She's an extraordinary person. And I couldn't see it because I was too busy looking for a solution. Ethan said nothing for a long time. Is it fixable? He finally asked. With Ava, do you think it's— I don't know, Victoria said honestly. I don't think that's within my power to answer, but you think it's fixable. She looked at her son with the specific love of a mother who knows she has failed in particular ways and succeeded in others, and is sitting in the rubble of a specific failure trying to be honest about it. I think, she said carefully, that the only thing that makes anything fixable is if the person doing the fixings actually changes. Not performs change, actually changes. Ethan absorbed this. Can you do that? She asked him honestly, not for her. Not to get her back. Can you become a man who doesn't go quiet? The question sat between them for a long moment, and for the first time in longer than Victoria could remember, her son looked at her without the particular wariness that had grown between them over years of pressure and silence and things not said. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her when he was 7 years old and he'd broken something and come to tell her about it, before she found it herself. Afraid, honest, certain that the truth was necessary even when it cost something. I don't know yet, he said, but I want to find out. Victoria nodded once, and somewhere in that nod, in the particular quality of her acceptance of his honest uncertainty over his reassuring lie, saw something shifted between them. Small, real, the first movement of something that had been locked for years. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't resolution. It was the beginning of a different kind of conversation. Meanwhile, in a kitchen 40 miles away, Ava Mitchell turned over a new page and wrote 2 more lines. Then her phone rang again. She looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize. It's a 617 area code. Boston. She answered it anyway because she had spent enough of her life avoiding unknown numbers. Hello, Miss Mitchell, a woman's voice, professional. Slightly formal. This is Rachel Okafor from the Kellerman Foundation. I understand your brother mentioned a slight pause. Actually, he didn't mention. He simply said, I should call you, immediately, that it would be worth my time, and that if I didn't call within the hour, he would reconsider his foundation's commitment to our capital campaign. Ava looked across the table at Daniel. He was studying his phone with the expression of a man who had absolutely no idea what she was about to say to him. He said that, did he? Ava said. He did. That sounds like it. She picked up her pen. Tell me about your Women's Transition Initiative, Miss Okafor. I'd like to hear everything, and that was how the next chapter began. Not with a grand gesture, not with a dramatic announcement, with a phone call and a pen. And a woman who had somewhere in the space between a soaked white dress and a cold marble floor, that the only direction worth moving in was forward. Rachel Okafor turned out to be exactly the kind of person Ava hadn't known she needed. She was 47 years old, the daughter of a Nigerian engineer and a Black American schoolteacher. And she had spent the last 12 years running the Kellerman Foundation's women's initiatives with the particular combination of warmth and precision that made people feel simultaneously seen and challenged. She had a laugh that arrived without warning and a habit of asking the second question before most people had finished answering the first. She called Ava at 9:43 on a Tuesday morning. By 11:15, they were still talking. "Walk me through what you're actually imagining," Rachel said. Not what Ava's firm had done before, not her portfolio. Not her awards, what she was imagining, not the architecture. The feeling. What do you want a woman to feel the moment she walks through the front door? Ava had answered this question in her head 100 times, in the dark, in the margins of other projects, in the space between what she was building professionally and what she needed to build personally. She'd never said it out loud to someone who was actually listening. Like she made the right decision, Ava said, coming in. Like the building itself is telling her that she made the right call by showing up. A pause on the other end. Say more. Most spaces designed for women in crisis are designed around the crisis. The colors are institutional, the furniture is utilitarian. Everything communicates you are here because something went wrong. I want a space that communicates the opposite. You are here because something is going right. You made it. You walked through that door, and that was the hardest thing, and you did it, and now we are going to build from here. Rachel was quiet for 3 seconds, then she said, "When can you come in?" They met 2 days later. The Kellerman Foundation offices were in a converted warehouse in the South End, and Rachel met her at the door personally, which Ava noticed. Small things like that, who comes to the door, who makes you wait, who treats the first 30 seconds as disposable, those things told her more about a person than an hour of conversation. Rachel shook her hand with both of hers and said, "I've been looking at your work since Daniel called." The Meridian renovation, the Ashworth Community Library in Roxbury. The Prescott Center, she paused. "You've been building toward this for years." "I didn't know that until recently," Ava said honestly. Rachel looked at her for a moment, the specific look of a woman who understood what recent meant in that sentence and was choosing not to make it the subject of the conversation. "Come inside. I have coffee and a problem I've been trying to solve for 8 months." The problem was this. The Kellerman Foundation had the funding, the mission, and the community relationships to build the most significant women's resource center in Boston's history. What they didn't have was a design partner who understood that the building itself was part of the intervention. 3 firms had presented proposals in the past 8 months. All 3 had produced beautiful, competent, forgettable designs that treated the space like a container rather than a message. Ava listened to all of this sitting across Rachel's desk, drinking her coffee, and by the time Rachel finished talking, she had already started seeing it. Not the floor plan, not the elevations, the feeling. The sequence of experiences from the moment a woman turned the corner and saw the building for the first time. "I want a week," Ava said. "For what? To talk to women who've used spaces like this. Not surveys, not focus groups, actual conversations. I want to sit with them and ask them what the worst moment was and what the first good moment was and what made the difference." She set down her coffee. "Then I'll show you what I'm thinking." Rachel studied her for a moment. Most designers present a concept first. Most designers haven't been in a situation where someone looked at them and decided they were worth nothing based on what they could see. Ava said it evenly, without drama. "I have, and I want to design from that place. But I need to make sure I'm designing from the right version of it." Rachel was quiet. Then she said, "Take 2 weeks, take whatever you need." That was a Thursday. By the following Monday, everything else had started moving. The story broke on a financial news site that
Specialized in the kind of reporting that wealthy family hates significant amounts of money to prevent.
It was a Monday morning, 6:17 a.m., and Ava was on her 3rd coffee and her 14th conversation with a woman named Denise, who had spent 4 years rebuilding her life after her husband's bankruptcy had erased everything they owned. Daniel texted her first, just a link, no comment. She clicked it. The headline read, "Hawthorne Family Empire in Freefall Exclusive Inside Look at 3 Generations of Hidden Debt." The article was 800 words, and it was precise in the specific way that only comes from someone with access to documents. It cited the mortgage on the East Wing, it cited the defaulted investment vehicles. It cited a source close to the family who described, in careful language, a years-long pattern of financial mismanagement concealed behind an impeccably maintained social facade. Ava read it twice, then she set her phone face down on the table and looked at Denise, who was sitting across from her in a coffee shop in Dorchester, and had been in the middle of describing the moment she realized her credit cards had all been canceled simultaneously. "I'm sorry," Ava said. "Please keep going, I want to hear the rest." Denise looked at her phone, face down on the table. "Everything okay? It will be," Ava said, "please." Denise kept going. Ava listened with everything she had, because Denise's story mattered more than the Hawthorne's exposure in a financial news article, and the work in front of her was real. And she had learned in the past week that the best thing she could do with the energy that the water-throwing incident had produced in her was turn it into something that served people who needed it. She dealt with the article at 6:45 p.m. when she was back at her desk. She called Daniel. "Did you leak it?" she asked. "No." "Daniel, Ava, I did not leak that article. My team identified their financial situation. That information stayed internal. Someone else found it." "Who, my guess? One of the 40 women from that afternoon?" Someone who knew a financial reporter. That story was always going to come out. The only question was timing. She was quiet for a moment. "How's Ethan?" A pause. "Why are you asking about Ethan?" "Because that article just destroyed whatever was left of his family's reputation, and I'm not a cruel person, Daniel. I ended things because they needed to end, not because I wanted them hurt." "He's fine," Daniel said, "or he will be. He called my office today, actually." Ava stopped. "What?" "He called my office. He asked to speak with me." "Not about you. He was very specific about that. He said he wasn't calling about Ava. He was calling because he wanted to ask for professional advice." "Professional advice?" "He's thinking about restructuring. About what the family can actually sustain versus what they've been performing." He said. Daniel paused. She could hear him deciding how much to say. He said he'd been living inside his mother's version of their situation for so long that he'd stopped being able to see it clearly. He wanted a perspective from someone who'd actually built something from nothing. Ava absorbed this. "You said yes," she said. "I said I'd think about it." "Daniel, I'm thinking." She closed her eyes. "He's not the villain of this story." "You know that. I know what he is," Daniel said. "I also know what he failed to do." "Those two things can both be true. They can," she agreed. "Be fair to him." A pause. "When have I ever been unfair?" She didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. She hung up and sat for a long time at her desk, looking at the preliminary sketches she'd made for the Cornerstone project. Rough lines, spatial ideas, the beginning of something that didn't exist yet. She thought about Ethan calling Nandiel's office, about the specific courage it took to call the brother of the woman you'd failed, for help, without using her as the reason. She thought about Victoria's voice on the phone. "I know." She thought about the way complicated things didn't resolve the way they did in the stories people told about complicated things. They just became more visible, more honest, more possible to work with, once you stopped pretending they were simple. Then her phone rang. Not Ethan, not Daniel. The number on the screen was one she recognized with a specific complicated lurch in her stomach. Margaret Alderley, one of the 40 women from that afternoon. The woman Victoria had been speaking to when Ava heard the conversation through the terrace door. She answered, "Miss Mitchell." Margaret's voice was different from what Ava would have expected. Not cold, not performing. Slightly ashamed, actually, which was perhaps the most unexpected thing. "I hope I'm not. I wasn't sure whether to call." "You called," Ava said simply. "Yes, I did." A pause. "I want you to know that I was not the person who spoke to the financial reporter." "Okay, but I know who did, and I want you to know that the woman who made that call did it because of what she witnessed on Saturday. Not to cause harm. She was—" Margaret stopped. Several of us were disturbed by what we saw. Victoria has been a friend of mine for 30 years, and what she did in that room was something I've never seen her do anything like that. Ava said nothing. "I called because I wanted to ask about your project." "The community center." Margaret's voice shifted. "Rachel Okafor called me last week. She mentioned your name. I sit on the Kellerman Foundation's advisory board. Ava sat very still. I've been looking for a project to commit to personally. Not institutionally, personally. I have resources that I've been wanting to put towards something real for. Margaret stopped again. What you said to Victoria before you left about a person's worth not being determined by their last name. I've been sitting with that since Saturday. Ava took us a slow breath. What are you saying, Mrs. Alderley? I'm saying I'd like to sit down with you. If you're willing, I understand if you're not. The call lasted 22 more minutes. By the end of it, Ava had a commitment for a private destination that would fully fund EASE, one of the Cornerstone Project, without touching the Kellerman Foundation's capital allocation at all. She sat at her desk after she hung up and looked at the number she'd written on the corner of her sketch pad. Then she looked at the rough lines of the building she'd been imagining. Then she laughed, short, surprised, entirely genuine. Because that was the thing about building something real. You could not always predict where the materials came from. 3 weeks after the afternoon at Hawthorne Manor, the story took a turn that nobody, not Ava, not Daniel, not Rachel Okafor, not Margaret Alderley had anticipated. Victoria Hawthorne called a press conference, not a social announcement. Not a quiet statement to the society pages. An actual press conference, which meant she'd hired a communications firm, which meant she'd spent money she didn't have on managing a narrative she'd spent years constructing. Ava found out about it the same way everyone else did. She was in a meeting with Rachel and 2 structural engineers when her phone started buzzing consecutively. Daniel, then 3 numbers she didn't recognize, then her assistant, then Daniel again. She excused herself. What happened? She asked Daniel. Turn on any financial channel, he said, or just wait 4 minutes, it's streaming live. She pulled it up on her phone. Victoria Hawthorne was standing at a podium in what looked like one of the smaller reception rooms of Hawthorne Manor. She was wearing a dark dress, simple jewelry, her silver hair pinned back. She looked, Ava thought, like a woman who had made a very particular decision about who she was going to be in this moment and had dressed accordingly. A journalist asked the first question before Victoria had finished her opening statement. Mrs. Hawthorne, reports indicate the family is facing significant financial difficulties. Can you confirm the extent of those difficulties? Victoria looked at the journalist steadily. I can confirm that our family has experienced serious financial setbacks over the past several years. I can confirm that we have not been forthcoming about the extent of those setbacks. And I can confirm that the decisions made to conceal that information were mine. The room erupted. Ava stood in the hallway outside the meeting room with her phone in her hand and watched Victoria Hawthorne in real time dismantle the architecture she'd spent decades constructing. My son had no meaningful role in the financial decisions that led to our current situation, Victoria continued over the noise. The concealment was mine. The decisions to maintain appearances at the cost of honesty were mine. Ethan has been as much a victim of those decisions as anyone. Another question from the back of the room, Mrs. Hawthorne, there have been reports about an incident involving your son's former fiancée, Ava Mitchell. Can you address? I can address that directly, Victoria said. The room went quiet again. On the afternoon of March 8th, I behaved in a manner that was indefensible. I publicly humiliated a young woman of extraordinary character because I had decided she wasn't valuable to my family's situation. I was wrong about her value in every possible way. And I was wrong about what value means. She paused. Ms. Mitchell is one of the finest people I have encountered in a long and sometimes not very fine life. What I did to her reflected nothing about her, and everything about the state of mind I had allowed myself to reach. The room erupted again. Ava's phone buzzed in her hand. A text from Daniel, 4 words, did not see that. She texted back, neither did I. She stood in that hallway for another 3 minutes watching Victoria answer questions with the specific, stripped-down directness of a woman who had decided, at 71 years old, that she was done performing. There was courage in it. Ava recognized courage even when it arrived from unexpected directions. She went back into the meeting. Everything okay? Rachel asked. Getting there, Ava said, and she meant it. What happened next moved faster than any of them expected. The press conference video was shared 600,000 times in the first 24 hours. Not because of the financial stories had a limited audience. But because of what Victoria said about Ava. Because someone in that original gathering of 40 women had filmed the water incident on their phone, and that video 17 seconds long, showing Victoria Hawthorne throwing the pitcher with deliberate force, had been circulating privately for 3 weeks, and suddenly, it was everywhere. Ava's name was everywhere with it. She woke up on a Wednesday morning to 47 interview requests, a voicemail from a producer at a morning news show she'd watched since college, and a text from her assistant that said simply, "Your inbox." "I'm sorry, also you have 12 new inquiries from potential clients. Also I need a raise." She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her phone for a long time. Then she called Daniel. "I need you to help me think through this," she said. "Not manage it, think through it, okay. There are people asking me to talk about what happened. To tell the story publicly, some of them want the drama. Some of them seem to actually want, I don't know." "Something real, what do you want?" Daniel asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I want to talk about the project. The Cornerstone Center. I want to use whatever attention is pointed at me right now to put it towards something that will outlast the attention." "That's smart, it's also true," she said. "Which matters more?" "Both matter," he said. Which interview? She'd already circled one. A journalist named Carmen Reyes who wrote for a long-form magazine that didn't do celebrity profiles. She wrote about people doing structural work in communities, the actual, unglamorous, important work of building things that helped. She had written a piece 2 years ago about a woman in Chicago who'd converted abandoned lots into community gardens after losing her home in the 2008 crash. It was the best piece of journalism Ava had read in 5 years. "Carmen Reyes," Ava said. "I know her work," Daniel said. "Good choice. I'm not telling the story as a revenge narrative," Ava said. "I need you to understand that. I do understand that. I'm telling it as the beginning of something, not the end of something." "Ava," his voice was warm and direct, "tell it however it's true." She called Carmen Reyes that morning. Carmen answered on the first ring, which told Ava something. People who answered on the first ring were either waiting for the call or they were the kind of person who just always answered. Carmen turned out to be both. "I've been hoping you'd call," Carmen said. "I want you to know up front that I'm not interested in the Hawthorne story. I mean, it's a story, but it's not the story I want to write." "What story do you want to write?" "I want to write about a woman who got humiliated in public and went home and started building something. That's the story that interests me, because that's the story that's actually unusual." Ava smiled. "Small, real. When can we meet? I'm in Boston tomorrow." "My office, 10 a.m. I'll be there at 9:55, Carmen said. She was there at 9:52. She was 39, with close-cropped natural hair, and a recorder she placed on the desk between them, and a notebook she barely looked at because she was too focused on actually listening. She didn't start with the incident. She started with Worcester. With the 2-bedroom apartment, with the parents' divorce and the $30 and the half-empty refrigerator. Ava told it honestly because Carmen was listening honestly, which made a specific kind of difference. She talked about putting herself through school, about starting her firm, about the years of building something real before she'd even been in a position to meet someone like Ethan Hawthorne. About what it felt like to want to be loved for who you were instead of what you came attached to. About the deliberate choice not to mention Daniel. "Why didn't you tell him?" Carmen asked. "About Daniel." "About Titan Core, about the money. Because I'd spent my whole life knowing that the money changed how people saw me," Ava said. "Not always to my advantage, actually. Sometimes being someone's wealthy sister is its own kind of erasure. You become a satellite instead of a center of gravity. I wanted to know if I could exist in someone's life as just me." "And what did you find out?" "I found out that the question matters more than the answer," Ava said. "Because the answer told me who was actually in the room. But the question is what I want to keep asking, about everyone." Carmen wrote something in her notebook. "Tell me about the Cornerstone Center." And Ava talked. For 40 minutes, she talked about Denise and the canceled credit cards, and the look on her face when she described the first space she'd walked into where she'd felt like a person instead of a problem to be managed. She talked about the 2 weeks of conversations she'd had with women rebuilding. She talked about what dignity looked like in architecture, how a ceiling height communicated something, how natural light communicated something, how the distance between the front door and the first point of human contact communicated something about whether you were expected to feel ashamed of arriving. "You're designing a feeling," Carmen said. "I'm designing a fact," Ava corrected gently. "The feeling is just the evidence that the fact exists." Carmen put down her pen and looked at Ava for a moment. "Can I tell you what I see, please? I see someone who got very publicly hurt, and instead of making the hurt the story, made it the fuel. And I don't mean that in a motivational poster way. I mean it in a structural way. You took the energy of that moment, the anger and the grief and the humiliation, and you pointed it at something that will exist in the world when all of this is forgotten. The article, Victoria's press conference, the video. All of that will cycle through the news and disappear. But the building you're describing will be there in 20 years. Ava looked at her. "That's the story," Carmen said. "That's what I want to write." "Then write it," Ava said. Carmen's article ran 6 weeks later in a print and digital edition that broke the magazine's single-day readership record. The headline was simple: "What Ava Mitchell built after the water hit the floor." It was 4,000 words. It didn't mention the Hawthorns by name except once, briefly, in the third paragraph, as context. The rest was about the Cornerstone Center, about Denise and the other women Ava had talked to. About what it meant to design a space that told people they deserved to be there. The day the article published, the Kellerman Foundation's donation portal received 11 times its normal daily traffic. Margaret Alderley called Ava at 4 in the afternoon. "My phone has not stopped," she said. There was something in her voice that Ava hadn't heard before. Something lighter. Rachel is beside herself in the best possible way. "Good," Ava said. "There are 3 more foundations that want to be involved. And a real estate developer in Cambridge who says he has a property he's been sitting on for 2 years that might be exactly what you need." Margaret paused. "Also, and I want to be transparent about this, Victoria called me this morning." Ava went still. She asked about the project. She wanted to know if there was any. She wanted to know if there was anything she could do. Any role. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was very clear about that. She said Margaret's voice was careful. She said she wanted to do something real. Not performative. Real. Ava was quiet for a long moment. The anger was still there. It would probably always be there in some form, small and honest, because it had been real and it had been earned, and it didn't disappear just because other things had grown up around it. But anger was not the only thing there. "Tell her," Ava said finally, "that we're having a community input session in 3 weeks. Open to anyone who wants to come. Tell her that if she wants to sit in a room with women who've had hard years and listen to what they need, she's welcome. Not as a donor, not as a name on a wall." She paused. As a person who shows up and listens, Margaret was quiet for a moment. "She may surprise you. She already has," Ava said. Twice. After she hung up, Ava sat at her desk and looked at the preliminary design she'd been refining for 2 weeks. It was starting to become something moving rough concept into actual form, the way buildings do slowly, through the accumulated decisions of dozens of small moments. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she'd saved under a name she'd almost deleted twice. "Ethan," the text was 4 lines. "I read the article. All of it. I'm proud of you for what that's worth from me. I met with Daniel last week. He was honest and unfair and harder on me than he needed to be, which I think means he was being exactly as hard on me as I needed him to be. I'm figuring some things out. I hope you are too." She read it 3 times, then she typed back, "I am." She put her phone down, she picked up her pen, and she went back to work. Because that was the thing she'd learned in the weeks since the water and the white dress and the convoy of black vehicles pulling up to a house that turned out to be built on borrowed foundation. She'd learned that the most important questions wasn't what people had done to you. The most important question was what you were going to build next. and she was building something that was going to stand. The community input session happened on a Thursday evening in the third week of April, in a borrowed conference room at a church in Dorchester that smelled like old wood and fresh coffee, and the particular combination of hope and pragmatism that Ava had come to associate with every space where real work got done. 31 women came. Ava had expected maybe 15. She'd told Rachel to prepare for 12 because she'd learned early in her career that the most honest plapa was always lower than the number people promised. And the worst thing you could do when you were asking people who'd already been let down repeatedly to show up for something new was to make them feel like they'd failed to fill a room. 31 women came anyway. They ranged in age from 23 to 78. Some came in work clothes, still carrying the day on them. Some came in careful outfits that told Ava they'd thought about what to wear, which told her something important about what this meant to them. One woman came with her teenage daughter and sat in the back row and spent the first 20 minutes not saying anything, just watching Ava the way people watch something they're not sure yet whether to trust. Ava noticed all of them. She always noticed everything. It was a professional habit that had become a personal one, and she'd stopped being able to tell the difference years ago. She started by not introducing herself. She started by asking a question. "Before we talk about what we're building," she said, standing at the front of the room, without a podium, without notes, without the protective distance of a presentation screen, "I want to ask you something. And I want you to answer it honestly, not helpfully. Not the answer you think I'm hoping for, the honest one." The room was quiet. "What's the one thing you needed most?" she said at the worst moment. Not resources, not services, not a hotline, the one thing you actually needed. She waited, silence for 4 seconds. 5, the woman in the back row with her daughter shifted in her seat. Then a woman in the third row, late 40s, natural hair going gray at the temples, hands folded in her lap with the precision of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as was offered and not 1 inch more, said, "To be treated like I still had good judgment." The room changed, not dramatically, but Ava felt it, the slight shift in collective posture, the barely perceptible relaxation of a group of people who had just heard one of their number say something true out loud. "Tell me more," Ava said. Her name was Gloria. She'd lost her home after her husband left and took the savings account she hadn't known existed. She'd spent 14 months in transitional housing and had navigated every system designed to help women in her situation with the sense of someone who was simultaneously grateful for the help and quietly devastated by the way it was offered. "Every place I went," Gloria said, "they talked to me like I needed to be explained to. Like I didn't understand my own situation, like they had to break it down for me." She paused. "I ran a department of 40 people for 11 years. I have an MBA, and I sat in rooms where people talked to me like I'd never made a decision before in my life." More nodding, not performative, the nodding of recognition. "That's what you're designing for," said the woman with her teenage daughter from the back. Her voice was flat, not unfriendly, testing not just the space. "The whole approach, yes," Ava said. "How do I know that?" the woman said. "How do I know you're not going to build something beautiful that still makes people feel like charity cases when they walk in?" It was the best question in the room, and Ava knew it immediately. "You don't," Ava said. "Not yet. That's why I'm here instead of at my drafting table. Because I can't design what I don't understand." She looked at the woman directly. "I need you to tell me what that feels like, so I can build the opposite of it." The woman looked at her for a long moment. Her daughter, beside her, was watching Ava with the focused attention of someone young enough to still believe that adults occasionally told the truth. "My name is Keisha," the woman said, "and you're going to want to write this down." Ava picked up her pen. The session ran 2 hours and 40 minutes past the scheduled end time. Nobody left. 3 women who had planned to speak to Ava privately afterward ended up speaking in the group, because the room had reached that specific temperature where privacy feels less necessary than being witnessed. It was nearly 10:30 when the last woman filed out. Rachel stayed to help fold chairs. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and then Rachel said, without looking up from the chair she was collapsing, "She came." Ava looked up. "Who?" She was in the back. She came in about 20 minutes after you started, and she stood against the wall the entire time. Rachel set the folded chair against the stack. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't say anything to anyone. She just listened. Ava went still, she asked. I saw her arrive. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to change how you ran the session. Rachel met her eyes. Was that wrong? Ava thought about the session. About the way it had gone honest and raw and real, the way it had needed to be. About whether knowing Victoria was in the room would have changed that. No, she said, that was right, she left before it ended. About 10 minutes before you wrapped up, Rachel picked up another chair. She left an envelope at the sign-in table with my name on it. No return address. What was in it? Rachel reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out to Ava. Ava took it. It was a handwritten note. 2 paragraphs in the careful, controlled handwritings of someone who had been educated in an era when handwriting was considered a reflection of character. The first paragraph said, I came because Ava Mitchell told me to come and listen. So I came and I listened. I heard things tonight that I have spent my entire life making sure I would never have to hear, not because they weren't true, but because I could afford not to hear them. I am not writing this to apologize again. I have said sorry enough times that the word has stopped meaning anything useful. The second paragraph said, I am writing because I want to do something specific. Attached is the contact information for my family's estate attorney. The east wing of Hawthorne Manor, the portion we have been attempting to sell. For 14 months, I would like to discuss the possibility of converting it. Not selling it, converting it, for whatever use this project determines is appropriate. I don't want my name on anything. I don't want recognition. I want the thing that was built in that house to become something that does actual good. If Ms. Mitchell finds this offer acceptable, please have her attorney contact mine. If she doesn't, I understand completely. Ava read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her own pocket. Rachel was watching her. Well, I need to think about it, Ava said. Of course you do. Rachel picked up the last chair. For what it's worth, the property assessment I had done on that east wing when we were evaluating the original site, it's exactly what we need. Structurally, locationally, all of it. It's actually better than the Cambridge site the developer mentioned. I know, Ava said. I know you know, Rachel said. I'm just saying it out loud so it's in the room. Ava looked at the empty space where 31 women had sat 2 hours ago. At the indentations in the carpet where the chairs had been. At the folded paper in her pocket. The building doesn't care who owns it, she said finally. Not to Rachel specifically, to herself, working something out. The building cares what it's used for. That's what you always say. It's what I always mean. She picked up her bag and her notebook. I'll call my attorney in the morning. The attorney's name was James Whitfield, and he had been Ava's legal counsel since the second year of her firm, when a contractor's dispute had required someone who knew what they were doing, and Rachel's cousin had recommended him over coffee. He was 61 years old, meticulous in the specific way of people who have seen enough disasters to understand that the details always matter, and he had the useful quality of never being surprised by anything. She called him at 8 the next morning. She told him about the letter. About the East Wing, about the offer. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. What's your instinct? He asked. My instinct is that it's genuine, she said. My instinct is also that genuine doesn't mean uncomplicated. Smart instinct, he said. I'll want to see the current mortgage structure on the property. If the East Wing is already pledged as collateral, the conversion offer may be structurally impossible regardless of intent. Can you find out? Give me 24 hours, he called back in 16. It's complicated, he said, which in James Whitfield's language meant, brace yourself. This is going to take longer than you want it to. The East Wing is pledged on the credit facility, as you already knew. But the credit facility is held by a private lender who has been trying to find an exit from this situation for 8 months. They're not interested in foreclosure. The carrying costs and the PR problem aren't worth it to them. He paused. Here's the interesting part. The lender, when I made inquiries through appropriate channels, indicated they would be open to a negotiated restructure if the asset were being repurposed for nonprofit use. Apparently, the principal at the lending firm has a history with charitable organizations, and the reputational value of this arrangement is... James, Ava said. Bottom line, it's possible, he said. It will take 6 to 8 weeks of negotiation minimum. It will require the Hawthorne family to formally deed the East Wing to a nonprofit entity, which means they lose the asset entirely, no equity recovery. And it will require the Kellerman Foundation to formally accept the asset and take on the renovation liability. A pause. It is possible, it is complicated, and it will require everyone involved to want it to work more than they want to protect themselves. Everyone involved, Ava repeated, including Victoria. Especially Victoria. She's the one walking away from the only remaining asset that might have partially offset their debt position. If she signs that deed, she's making a choice that has no financial upside for her family whatsoever. Ava was quiet. That's either genuine or it's the most sophisticated long-game reputation management I've ever seen, James said. I've been doing this for 32 years and I genuinely cannot tell which. I can, Ava said. How? Because the sophisticated long-game version would have put her name on it, Ava said. She specifically said no name, no recognition. She looked at the folded letter on her desk. She's not doing this for credit. She's doing it because she sat in a room for 2.5 hours and heard 31 women describe what it felt like to be treated like they had no value, and she recognized herself in the people who'd done the treating. Silence on James's end. That's either true or it's a very good story you're telling yourself, he said. I know, she said. Start the negotiation, we'll find out which. While the attorneys began their careful, document-heavy work of restructuring what could be restructured, the rest of the world kept moving with the particular indifference of a world that has 1,000 stories cycling simultaneously and has already moved 3 news cycles past the water and the white dress and the crystal pitcher. Ava's inbox had settled from 47 interview requests to a manageable trickle. The Cornerstone Project had been written about in 4 publications in addition to Carmen's piece, each of them taking a slightly different angle: the architecture angle, the women's advocacy angle, the Boston community development angle, and, inevitably, the human interest angle that was really just the Hawthorne story retold with more sympathy for Ava and more complexity for Victoria. She did 2 more interviews, both of them about the project. Neither of them about the incident, which she declined to discuss, not because she was hiding it, but because she'd already said she needed to say, and she didn't believe in performing her own story indefinitely. Ethan called her on a Tuesday afternoon in early May. Not a text this time, an actual phone call, which took more attention, which she appreciated. She answered. Hey, he said. Hey, is this okay calling? You called, I answered, so yes, he laughed, short. A little uncertain. I'm in Boston. I've been here for 3 weeks, actually. Working with Daniel's restructuring contact on the financial situation. A pause. It's complicated, doesn't begin to cover it. I know, she said. James has been in contact with your family's attorney about the East Wing. I know, he said. That's actually, I wanted to talk to you about that. Not to change anything, just to say that my mother made that decision alone. I found out the same way everyone else did, through the attorneys. Does it bother you? A pause. Honest, it bothered me for about 12 hours. And then I thought about why she did it and it stopped bothering me and started being, I don't know. The most real thing she's done in a long time. Ava thought about Victoria standing against the wall in the church conference room, listening to Gloria and Keisha and 29 other women describe what it felt like to be seen as less than. Staying for 2 hours, leaving an envelope, asking for nothing in return. She surprised me, Ava said. She surprised both of us, Ethan said. And there was something in his voice, not quite grief, not quite relief, something that sat between them. I've been in therapy since March. I want you to know that, not because I think it changes anything between us, but because you asked me a question in that room. About whether I knew I could become a man who doesn't go quiet. And I wanted to work on having an actual answer. Ava leaned back in her chair. The afternoon light was coming through the window behind her desk, warm and specific, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more honest than it does the rest of the day. "What's the answer?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "But I'm getting there." "That's a good answer," she said. "It's the true one." They were quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortably, the particular quiet of two people who have moved through something together and arrived at a place that is neither beginning nor end, but something more honest than either. "I'm not going to ask for another chance," Ethan said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not calling because I'm angling for something. I'm calling because I wanted to say out loud to you that you were the best thing in my life for 2 years, and I didn't protect that, and I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that needs anything back, just the true kind." Ava felt something shift in her chest, small, real. Not romantic, she was clear about that, clear with herself in the specific way you have to be clear when you're still close enough to something to feel its gravity. "But real, thank you," she said, "for meaning it." "I do mean it, I know." After she sat for a few minutes without moving. Without picking up a pen or opening a file or reaching for her coffee. Just sat, and let the moment be what it was, complicated and human, and moving forward the way things move forward, not cleanly, not according to anyone's preferred timeline, but forward. Then her phone buzzed. "Daniel, you talked to Ethan," he said when she answered. "Not a question. Spying on me, he told me he was going to call you." I told him it was his choice. A pause. "How are you?" "Good," she said, and meant it. Not perfectly fine, not finished processing, not done with the complicated parts. But genuinely, actually good. "How are you?" "I want to show you something," he said. "Can you come to Cambridge tonight, 7 o'clock? "What is it? Just come," he said. Trust me, she trusted him. She drove to Cambridge at 6:45, arrived at Daniel's house at 7:02, and found 3 cars she didn't recognize parked on the street outside. Daniel met her at the door with a coffee and an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and not quite managing it. "Who's inside?" she asked. "People I want you to meet." "Daniel, just come in," he said. The people inside turned out to be 4 individuals who had been, in various capacities and for various reasons, watching the Cornerstone project from a distance for the past 6 weeks. 2 of them were architects, one who had built a similar center in Philadelphia 7 years ago, and had spent that time learning everything about what worked and what didn't, and one who had been following Ava's career specifically for 3 years and had, apparently, told Daniel at an industry event in February that Ava Mitchell was the most important designer of her generation, and he'd been waiting for her to do something that matched her actual scale. The third was a woman named Sylvia Park, who ran a foundation that had been looking for a flagship project to anchor a 10-year women's economic empowerment initiative, and who had flown from San Francisco specifically for this meeting. The fourth was Rachel Okafor, who caught Ava's eye across the room with an expression of carefully maintained innocence that communicated, "I may have known about this in advance." Daniel set down his coffee and addressed the room in the particular way he addressed rooms, when he'd already decided what he wanted to happen and was creating the conditions for it. "Ava doesn't know why she's here," he said, "so I'm going to let Sylvia explain." Sylvia Park was 53, Korean-American, with the specific directness of someone who has made important decisions in high-stakes rooms for long enough that she no longer felt the need to soften the approach. She looked at Ava and said, "We want to expand the model. Not just Cornerstone, the Cornerstone approach, the design philosophy, the community input methodology. We've been watching what you're building in Boston, and we want to replicate it in 7 cities over the next 5 years." Ava looked at her. 7 cities, she said. 7 to start. "We have identified sites in Chicago, Atlanta, Houston, Phoenix, Seattle, Denver, and pending the property conversion you're currently negotiating, we'd like to add Boston to the flagship list and make it the model all the others are built from." The room was very quiet. Ava looked at Daniel. "You set this up." "I introduced some people," he said. "What they decided to do after that is their own business." "Daniel, Ava," his voice was warm, the specific warmth of an older brother who has been waiting 6 weeks to watch his sister's face at this exact moment. "Let them finish," Sylvia continued. "The initiative had a name, the Cornerstone Network. It had a 5-year funding commitment that made Ava's throat tight when she heard the number, not because she hadn't seen large numbers before. She was Daniel Mitchell's sister. She'd seen plenty of large numbers, but because this one was attached to something she'd been carrying in her chest for 2 years, and there is a specific physical sensation that comes with the moment a thing you've imagined privately becomes publicly possible. The architect who'd built the Philadelphia Center, his name was Marcus Webb, and he had the careful hands and deliberate voice of someone who took every word seriously, said, "I want to be your senior advisor on this. Not a partner. I'm not trying to attach my name to what you're building. I want to be the person you call when you hit the wall that I already hit in Philly in year 2, so you don't have to spend 6 months figuring out what I already know." Ava looked at him. "Why? Because I've been doing this for 20 years and I recognize someone who's going to do it better than me," he said simply. "And the work matters more than my ego," she believed him. The fourth person in the room, the architect who'd told Daniel she was the most important designer of her generation, was named Priya Anand. And she was quieter than the others, and she waited until everyone else had spoken to say the thing she'd come to say. "I want to join your firm," she said, "not to run it. To work in it. I have a practice in New York that I've been doing alone for 4 years, and I'm very good at it, and it's not enough." She looked at Ava directly. "I read the Carmen Reyes article on the morning it was published. And I sat at my desk and I looked at what I'd been building, and I thought, I am spending my talent on the wrong things. I want to spend it on this." The silence that followed lasted 6 seconds. Then Ava said, "Send me your portfolio Monday morning." Priya nodded once, controlled, but her eyes gave something away. Daniel refilled everyone's coffee and the conversation for another 2 hours, practical, detailed, real. Site assessments and timeline projections and design philosophy and community engagement methodology and funding structures and governance models. It was nearly 10 o'clock when people started gathering their things. Sylvia Park stopped at the door, shook Ava's hand with both of hers the way Rachel had the first time they'd met, and Ava thought, this is a thing that certain women do. This specific handshake. It means, I see you, I take you seriously, I am not going to waste your time. One more thing, Sylvia said, for what it's worth. The way this started the incident at the Hawthorne house. The video, the article, all of it. She paused. I want you to know that none of that is why we're here. We didn't come because of a viral moment, we came because of the work. I know, Ava said. I wanted to say it out loud anyway. Thank you, Ava said, for meaning it. After everyone left, Ava and Daniel sat in his kitchen the way they always sat, at the kitchen table with their coffee, and the house was quiet around them. You could have warned me, she said. You would have prepared a presentation. That's not, she stopped. Okay, yes, I would have prepared a presentation. And then it would have been a meeting instead of a conversation. And the whole point was to have a conversation. She wrapped both hands around her mug. 7 cities to start, Daniel, I know, he said. She looked at him across the table, this man who had answered on the second ring since she was 9 years old. Who had driven 40 miles on a Tuesday and walked through a stranger's door and put his jacket on her shoulders. Who had introduced some people and let them decide what they wanted to do, and was now sitting across from her with coffee and his completely unsurprised expression. Thank you, she said. For what? For knowing when to step in and when to step back. He was quiet for a moment. I'm still learning the difference. So am I, she said. Yeah, he said, but you're better at it. She didn't argue. Some things are true and arguing about them is just theater. She drove home at 10:45. The streets were quiet, the way Boston gets quiet on weeknight evenings in May, the city doing its breathing. She drove with the windows down slightly, the spring air coming in cold and clean, and she thought about the 31 women in the church room, and Gloria's folded hands, and Keisha's daughter watching from the back row, and Victoria standing against the wall listening to things she'd spent her life not hearing. She thought about a building that didn't exist yet but was going to. 7 buildings in 7 cities, and then more. She thought about Ethan's voice on the phone. Not yet, but getting there, the true kind of sorry. She thought about the white dress. She thought about the water. She thought about standing there, soaked, on the marble floor, refusing to fall. And she understood, not for the first time, but more completely than she had before, that the moment she'd been so afraid of, the moment she'd been humiliated in front of 40 people by a woman who'd looked at her and seen nothing worth valuing, was not the worst thing that had ever happened to her. It was the beginning of the best thing she had ever built. She parked outside her building and sat in the car for a moment before going in. She texted Carmen Reyes, "Update for you when you're ready." The story got bigger. Carmen texted back in 45 seconds. "I knew it would. Cough Friday," Ava wrote. 9:52, she could almost hear Carmen laugh. She put her phone in her pocket and walked inside. She had work to do in the morning. The coffee with Carmen happened on a Friday morning at 9:52, exactly, in the same South End cafe, where Ava had taken her first call from Rachel Okafor 4 months earlier. Carmen arrived with her recorder already on the table, and her notebook already open, which told Ava she'd been thinking about this conversation since the text. 7 cities, Carmen said before she'd even taken off her coat. 7 to start, Ava said. Carmen sat down and looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a journalist who is deciding whether to lead with the question she prepared or the one that just occurred to her. She chose the one that just occurred to her. How do you feel? Not what's happening, not what's next. How do you feel? Ava wrapped her hands around her coffee. Like I'm standing at the top of something I've been climbing for a long time and I can finally see how far it goes in both directions. Carmen wrote that down verbatim, Ava noticed. Scared? Carmen asked. Constantly, Ava said, but that's not new. What's new? Ava thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to do everything lately, without the protective layer of performance, without the careful curation of which truths were safe to say out loud. What's new is that the fear doesn't feel like a reason to stop. It used to feel like information, like the fear was telling me something was wrong. Now it feels like evidence that I'm doing something that matters. Things that don't matter don't make you afraid. Carmen looked up from her notebook. Can I say something off the record? Yes, you're different than you were in February. When we first sat across from each other, I know. Not harder, Carmen said carefully. I want to be precise about this. Not tougher, not more guarded, just more settled. Like you found the floor under yourself. Ava was quiet for a moment. Then she said someone threw ice water on me and I didn't fall down. I think that was the floor. Carmen nodded slowly. Put her pen down, picked it back up. Okay, tell me everything. The conversation lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, Carmen had 12 pages of notes, and the particular brightness in her expression that Ava had come to recognize as the sign of a journalist who has found the real center of a story she thought she already understood. This isn't an update, Carmen said, gathering her things. This is a different article entirely. I know, Ava said. It's going to be a cover. Ava looked at her. I'm not asking. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Carmen put her recorder in her bag. Because the first piece was about what you built after the water hit the floor. This one is about what happens when the building starts to change other buildings. She paused at the door. That's a bigger story, Ava. That's the actual story. She left. Ava sat with her cold coffee for a few minutes and thought about that. The actual story. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed. Not a call this time. A text from a number she'd saved 3 weeks ago under a name she still found slightly surreal to have in her contacts. Victoria Hawthorne, the attorneys called this morning. James said the conversion is moving forward. I wanted you to hear it from me directly before the formal confirmation. Ava stared at the text for a moment, then she typed back, "Thank you for telling me." "And thank you for what you did." The response came 40 seconds later. Victoria Hawthorne, it was the least I could do. I'm aware that least is accurate. Ava almost smiled, almost. She put her phone in her pocket and walked out into the May morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the specific quality of the air warm but not hot yet, the city still in the reasonable, manageable part of spring before summer arrived, and made everything harder. And she thought about the east wing of Hawthorne Manor being converted into something that served the women Victoria had spent a lifetime not seeing. She thought about what Rachel had said once, early in this process: the building doesn't know who paid for it. The building only knows what it's used for. She believed that. She was going to keep believing it. She walked to her car and drove to her office and went to work. The groundbreaking happened on a Tuesday in June, on a morning that was overcast and slightly too warm and threatening rain, in the way that Boston mornings in June frequently did: all bluster, rarely follow through. 40 people gathered on the site, not 200. Not a crowd. 40 people who had been part of this thing from the beginning, in one form or another, and who were here not for the spectacle, but for the moment. Rachel was there. Marcus Webb flew in from Philadelphia. Priya Anand had joined Ava's firm 6 weeks earlier and was standing slightly to the left of center with a hard hat and the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to show how much this moment means to them and not entirely succeeding. Sylvia Park had come from San Francisco. James Whitfield stood near the back in a suit that was appropriate for a groundbreaking ceremony, in the way that all of James's clothing was appropriate for everything, because James planned for contingencies. Carmen Reyes was there with a photographer, which Ava had agreed to on the condition that the photographs focused on the site and the people who'd been part of building toward this moment, not on Ava specifically. Carmen had agreed. The photographer had spent 40 minutes photographing Gloria from the community input session, who turned out to have a face that a camera loved in the way that faces sometimes do: all structure and honesty and the specific luminosity of someone who has been through the worst and is now standing in the sun. Keisha was there too, with her daughter, who was 17 and had been asking Ava questions by email for 2 months: detailed, precise, architectural questions that revealed a mind that processed space the way Ava's did, as language, as communication, as argument. Ava had been answering everyone. Daniel arrived at 10:58, 2 minutes before the ceremony started, which was his version of early. He stood beside Ava and looked at the site and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Dad would have said something annoying and sentimental right now." He absolutely would have, Ava agreed. Mom would have cried. She would have cried before she got out of the car. They stood together in comfortable silence for another moment. The overcast sky held its rain. A bird called from somewhere Ava couldn't identify. "You did this," Daniel said. "We did this," she said. "No," he was quiet but certain. "I wrote some checks and made some calls." "This was you. I want you to know I know the difference." She looked at him. He was looking at the site, at the cleared ground, and the surveying stakes, and the beginning of the thing that wasn't yet a thing, but was going to be, with the expression she'd last seen on his face when his company had gone public, and he'd stood in the lobby of the New York Stock Exchange and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd built, just for a moment, before putting it back in his chest and moving to the next thing. "I'm proud of you," he said, "not because of what you built, because of how." She felt this land in the specific place where the truest things always landed. "Don't get sentimental," she said. "It's before noon." He laughed, that short, genuine laugh. "God, you really are like Mom." She smiled, turned toward the gathered group. Rachel was at the microphone, a portable, barely their setup, because this wasn't that kind of event. She introduced the project simply and honestly, and without the performative emotion that these ceremonies sometimes collapsed into, because Rachel Okafor had been doing real work for long enough to know that the work didn't need to be dramatized. It was dramatic enough on its own. Then she handed the microphone to Ava. Ava stood in front of 40 people and felt for a brief moment the particular weightlessness that comes before you say something true in a room that's ready to hear it. She didn't use notes. "I want to tell you why this building is going to look the way it's going to look," she said. Not the technical reasons, the real reason. The group was quiet. That good quiet, the listening kind. 4 months ago, I sat in a church conference room in Dorchester and I asked a group of women what they needed most at the worst moment of their lives. And a woman named Gloria, who is standing right over there, said, "To be treated like I still had good judgment." She paused. "I've been designing buildings for 12 years. I've won awards. I've had projects published and studied and written about." And that sentence, 7 words from a woman I'd met 40 minutes earlier, is the most important design brief I've ever received. Gloria, across the small crowd, was doing the careful thing that people do when they're trying not to cry in public. Her hands were folded exactly the way they'd been folded in the church room. Her jaw was set with the precision of someone exerting deliberate control over their own face. She was not entirely succeeding either. This building, Ava continued, is going to tell every woman who walks through its front door the same thing. Not with a sign, not with a mission statement in the lobby. With the ceiling height and the light and the way the entrance is designed so that the first person you see when you come in is not sitting behind a desk, looking down at you but standing on the same level, ready to walk forward with you. She stopped. Let the moment breathe. Architecture is a language. Every building says something. This one is going to say you made the right decision by coming here. You have good judgment. You belong. The rain that had been threatening all morning arrived at that exact moment, not a downpour, not dramatic, just a light, steady rain that came without announcement and settled over everything equally. Nobody moved. 40 people stood in the June rain and didn't move, and that more than any speech, more than Simisi ceremony, told Ava everything she needed to know about what this moment meant. Rachel handed out shovels. The first one went to Gloria. The second to Keisha, the third to Ava. They broke ground in the rain, the three of them, while the photographer captured something that would run 6 weeks later, as the full cover of Carmen's magazine. 3 women, shovels in the ground, rain coming down, all of them looking not at the camera but forward at the cleared earth and what was going to rise from it. Ava didn't know about the cover yet. That was still 6 weeks away. What she knew, standing in that June rain with a shovel in her hands, was that the ground was real and the work was real, and the thing they were building was going to be real in a way that no amount of humiliation or silence or thrown water could touch. She knew that. She felt it in the specific, physical way that you feel the truest things not in your mind, not as a thought, but in your body, in your chest. In the part of you that was 9 years old and terrified and waiting for the other shoe to drop, and has spent the intervening years slowly and with great difficulty to trust that not every floor disappears. This one wasn't going anywhere. 3 weeks after the groundbreaking, the twist arrived. Not a dramatic one, not the kind with raised voices or crystal pitchers or convoys of black vehicles pulling up to mansions. The quiet kind, which is always the kind that lands hardest. It came in the form of a letter, delivered to Ava's office by hand, on a Thursday afternoon when she was in a meeting with Priya about the Chicago site assessment. Her assistant knocked, apologized for interrupting, and said only, this was marked personal. The person who delivered it said it was time-sensitive. Ava looked at the envelope, her name handwritten. No return address, but she recognized the handwriting. She'd seen it once before, on a folded piece of paper that Rachel had handed her in a darkened conference room that had changed the direction of everything. She excused herself. She opened the letter in her office with the door closed. It was 3 pages, handwritten, Victoria Hawthorne's controlled, careful script, slightly less controlled than the first note, as though the act of writing had loosened something that the first letter had still been holding in place. The first page was about Ethan. Victoria wrote that her son had told her, the previous Sunday over dinner, the first dinner they'd had together in months, that didn't involve attorneys or financial advisors, that he was in love with someone new. A woman he'd met through the restructuring process, a financial analyst named Clara, who had apparently spent 3 weeks helping untangle the Hawthorne family accounts, and had somewhere in that process managed to see past the Hawthorne family situation to Ethan himself, which Victoria wrote about with a kind of wondering honesty that surprised Ava, the wonder of a mother watching her son be seen clearly by someone, for the first time in a long time. Ava read this paragraph twice. She checked herself carefully the way she'd been checking herself about Ethan for months, looking for the grief or the jealousy or the complicated possessiveness that she'd been half expecting to arrive. She found none of those things. She found something cleaner. Something that felt almost like relief, and underneath the relief, a genuine warmth for a man who was, as he'd said himself, figuring some things out and apparently getting somewhere. She was glad for him. She meant it completely. The second page was about the East Wing conversion. Technical details, timeline, a specific request from Victoria direct undecorated about whether Ava would be willing to consult on one aspect of the interior design. Not the whole project, which Victoria understood was Ava's domain and not hers to request. One room, the main entrance hall. Victoria wrote, with the particular self-awareness of someone who had spent several months acquiring an unfamiliar honesty, I know what that entrance should feel like because I know what it felt like to be in a room where you were made to feel you didn't belong. I thought about it differently after the church session. I want to help design the opposite of that feeling. If you're willing to have that conversation, Ava set the second page on her desk. She sat with it for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Victoria directly, which she had not done once in 4 months, had responded to texts, had communicated through attorneys and Rachel and James, but had not called. Victoria answered on the second ring, Ava. Her voice had the quality it had developed since the press conference, stripped of its performance layer, slightly uncertain in the way of someone who was no longer relying on a script they'd memorized. I read your letter, Ava said. I wasn't sure you would. I read everything, a pause, the part about Ethan. I wanted you to hear it from me. It's good news, Ava said simply. I mean that. A longer pause, something shifted in the breathing on Victoria's end. I'm genuinely glad, Ava said. He deserves someone who sees him clearly. Clara sounds like she does. Victoria was quiet for several seconds. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly different, not broken, but opened, the way a window opens, letting in air and light and the particular vulnerability of an outside world making contact with an inside one. You're a better person than I deserve to be having this conversation with. You sat in that room for 2.5 hours, Ava said. In the rain, you stood in the rain, you signed a deed that cost your family the last significant asset it had. She paused. I don't know if people deserve things. I think people do things, and the things they do tell the story. What does my story tell? Victoria asked, not defensively. With genuine, slightly frightened curiosity. It tells that you're capable of changing, Ava said, which is more than a lot of people's stories tell. The silence after this was different from any of the previous silences in any of the previous conversations between these two women. It had a quality of arrival to it, of something having traveled a very long distance and reached, finally, the place it was going. The entrance hall, Ava said, come to my office Monday morning. Bring any ideas you have, we'll talk, Victoria said. I'll be there at 9. I'll have coffee ready, Ava said. She hung up. She sat at her desk and looked at the 3 pages of Victoria Hawthorne's handwriting laid out in front of her. At the careful script going slightly less careful as the pages progressed. At the specific courage it took to write 3 pages of honest things to the person you'd humiliated most publicly and still ask for something, not forgiveness, which Victoria had consistently declined to ask for, but connection. Participation, the chance to be useful in the building of the thing you'd helped inadvertently to create. Ava thought about the architecture of redemption. She thought about it in the same way she thought about the architecture of buildings. What does it look like? What does it feel from the inside? What is the sequence of experiences that take someone from one state to another? What does the entrance look like? What does a person feel in the first 30 seconds? She thought Victoria Hawthorne had been in the entrance for 4 months now. The question was what she was going to build from here. The same question, Ava thought, that applied to everyone. The cover of Carmen's magazine hit newsstands on a Thursday, about 6 weeks after the groundbreaking. The photograph was exactly what Carmen had promised: Gloria and Keisha and Ava, shovels in the ground, rain coming down, all 3 of them looking forward. The headline was 7 words: she built something that cannot be thrown away. Ava didn't see it until 8 a.m. when her assistant sent her a photo of it with a text that said only, coffee. Now you're going to need it. She looked at the photograph for a long time. At Gloria's folded hands uncurled now, gripping a shovel. At Keisha's jaw set against the rain. At her own face, which she studied with the particular objectivity of someone looking at a photograph of themselves and trying to see what other people see. She looked not like someone who had survived something. Not like someone who had won something. She looked like someone who was in the middle of building something that was going to take years. And she was not afraid. She was not afraid. She put her phone down and went to her drafting table. Daniel called at 8:45. Cover, he said. I saw. How do you feel? She thought about Carmen asking her the same question 4 months ago in the same cafe. Like I found the floor under myself, she said, a pause. He recognized the callback. Yeah, he said, that's what it looks like. Don't get sentimental, she said. It's not even 9 a.m., he said. I'm not capable of sentiment before 9, liar, she said. He laughed. She heard it, that short, genuine sound, and felt the specific warmth of it, the warmth of a thing that had been there her entire life and that she would never take for granted again. Because she had spent 4 months understanding with increased precision exactly how much it cost Tef to be known and loved by someone who showed up when it mattered. I need to go, she said. I have work, I know, he said. Go, she went. The Cornerstone Tower opened 11 months after the groundbreaking, on a warm April morning that arrived with actual sunlight for once, as though the weather had looked at the calendar and decided to cooperate. 230 people came, not just the 40 from the groundbreaking, not just the foundations and the architects and the journalists and the attorneys and the people who had been part of building this from the first phone call to the last inspection. Community members, neighbors, women who had heard about the center from other women who had heard about it from someone else entirely, the way word travels when it's carrying something real. Gloria was there. She'd become a regular presence in the project, had joined the Community Advisory Board 6 months ago, at Rachel's invitation, and had turned out to have opinions about spatial design that were precise and specific and consistently right, which Ava had told her directly more than once because some things need to be said out loud. Keisha was there. Her daughter Amara, who had been emailing Ava architectural questions since October, was standing near the entrance with a notepad, documenting the opening with the focused attention of someone who was already practicing the work she intended to do with her life. Ava had written her a letter of recommendation for a summer design program 2 months ago. Amara had gotten in. Priya was there, standing near the structural column she'd spent 6 weeks arguing with the engineering team about and winning, because she'd been right and she'd known it and she'd kept saying so until everyone else caught up. She looked at it now with the expression of an architect who has made something that is going to stand for 50 years and knows it. Marcus Webb flew in from Philadelphia. He stood in the entrance hall for 4 minutes without saying anything, just feeling the space, and then he turned to Ava and said, "You solved the problem we've had in Philly since year 1. The sequence from the door to the first human contact." "How did you?" Gloria Ava said simply. Marcus nodded. Understanding immediately, of course, Victoria Hawthorne came alone. She arrived slightly after 10, which was after the formal opening remarks and during the open house portion, which Ava thought was probably deliberate, the choice not to occupy the ceremonial space, to come in during the part where people were walking through and experiencing the building, rather than watching it be unveiled. Ava saw her from across the room. Victoria looked different from the woman who had stood at that podium 3 months ago. Or maybe she didn't look different. Maybe she'd always had this quality underneath the performance, and it was simply visible now in the way that things become visible when the performance stops. She looked like a woman who had made decisions that cost her something real and was living with those decisions without flinching. She walked through the entrance hall, the one she'd helped design, in Monday morning meetings that had started in early February and run for 6 weeks, over coffee that was always ready when she arrived, and she stood in the space for a moment, feeling the ceiling height, feeling the light, feeling the distance from the door to the first desk. Then she found said, "Not I love it. Not it's beautiful, it's right." The word she'd kept coming back to in all those Monday morning meetings when they talked about the entrance, not what looks good, what is right. What tells the truth about what this space is for? It is, Ava agreed. Victoria looked around the room. At the women moving through the space, touching walls, looking up at windows, sitting in chairs that were designed to feel like choices rather than assignments. At Gloria, deep in conversation with a young woman Ava didn't recognize. at Amara, sketching something in her notepad near the south window. "I keep thinking about what I would have built," Victoria said quietly. "If I'd used the last 30 years differently, what would you have built?" Ava asked. Not as a challenge, as a genuine question, Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Something more honest," she said. "Something that didn't require so much maintenance." She looked at the entrance hall around her. "Something like this," Ava nodded. "You still have time." Victoria met her eyes. "At my age, you have time," Ava said again. "Firm, certain. The Cornerstone Network is opening in Chicago in 14 months. Rachel needs an advisory board member with specific expertise in navigating legacy institutions and their relationship to community organizations." She paused. "I think that description might fit someone we both know." Victoria stared at her. "It's unpaid," Ava said, "and Rachel will work you very hard. And you'll be in rooms with women who have very little patience for anyone who treats them like they don't belong." Victoria stopped, started again. "Are you serious?" "I'm always serious when it matters," Ava said. "Talk to Rachel today if you're interested. She's near the coffee."
She left Victoria standing in the entrance hall and moved through the crowd, shaking hands, answering questions.
Stopping to listen to a woman she'd never met before, who had heard about the center from a friend, who'd heard about it from a coworker, and had taken 2 buses to get here this morning because she said, pressing Ava's hand between both of hers, "I didn't know a building could feel like this. Like it was waiting for me." Ava said, "That's exactly what it's for." Daniel found her at noon, in the room that would become the Professional Development Center, not quite finished yet, the last of the furniture still arriving next week, where she'd stepped away for 5 minutes of quiet in the middle of the noise. He stood in the doorway. He looked at his sister, standing in a room that hadn't existed a year ago, in a building that had started with a phone call and a pen and a decision to stop waiting for the right time and simply begin. "You okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," she said. "Yeah," he said. "You look it." He came and stood beside her. They looked at the room, the light coming through the windows, the empty space, waiting to become the next thing, the walls that were already beginning to hold the specific quality of a place where people would do important work. "I've been thinking about what you said," Daniel said. "Months ago, in the car, about needing to know if people loved you for who you were." "What about it?" "I think you found out," he said simply. Ava thought about the phone call from Rachel, about Margaret Alderley's handshake, about Carmen Reyes and her recorder and her cover story, about Gloria's folded hands and Keisha's daughter, and Priya arguing with engineers about a structural column, and Victoria arriving slightly late and saying it's right, about Ethan's text not yet but getting there and his new woman who saw him clearly. She thought about all the people who had looked at her over the past year and decided for their own reasons whether she was worth seeing. And she thought about what she'd decided, about herself, in the space between the water hitting the floor and the shovel hitting the ground. "I found out," she said. Daniel nodded once. They stood together in the unfinished room while the sound of 230 people moved through the building around them, voices, footsteps, the specific percussion of a space being inhabited for the first time, learning what it was going to sound like when it was full. The building was already answering. Outside, the April sun kept coming. And Ava Mitchell, who had been thrown water at in a borrowed white dress by a woman who thought she was nobody, who had stood soaked on a marble floor and refused to fall, who had driven home in her brother's jacket and picked up a pen and started building. Ava Mitchell is the center of what she had made and understood, with the kind of certainty that doesn't require proof, because it is itself the proof that this was what she had always been capable of. She had simply needed someone to underestimate her badly enough that she stopped waiting for permission to prove it. The water had been the beginning. This was what grew from the ground where it fell, and it was going to stand for a very long time.